You know, we Americans are absolutely repulsed at the idea of a king. It's oppressive and tyrannical to us. We value freedom and would never yield to the dominance of a single royal family. It's why we're Americans. It's what caused us to become Americans. But the ancient Israelis loved their king. They were royalist. They enjoyed the pomp and the circumstance of a monarchy. It was a source of national pride to them. They took for granted that the nation's destiny was largely tied to the success or failure of their king. And that was particularly true in the reign of David. So 3 kings ruled over the whole united kingdom, the all 12 tribes: Saul, David, and Solomon. But only 3 reigned over the fully united kingdom. After Solomon, the nation was divided by a civil war. And 19 kings then ruled over the northern kingdom of Israel, and 20 kings ruled over the southern kingdom of Judah. And that entire period covered about 500 years, okay? Now here's something interesting. In the Hebrew Bible, the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings are actually considered one book. So all 4 of those books in the Hebrew Bible are considered one book and go up by the name of kingdoms. Jewish tradition says they were written by the prophet Jeremiah. And by the way, these 4 books were together until, I've told you many, many times before, don't pay a whole lot of attention to chapter divisions and to verse divisions, because they were not put into the Bible until the 16th century. So these 4 books called kingdoms, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, were all one book until 1516 AD. And in 1516 AD, they were divided into 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. 2nd Samuel, that we looked at last week, closes in the midst of Israel's greatest king, David. 1st Kings, that we're in today, opens in the waning days of David's rule and records in the beginning the transfer of power from King David to his son Solomon. And as we saw between Saul and David, it did not go well. The transition was a bloody and painful transition. But first, 1 Kings 2 records the deathbed scene between David and Solomon. Deathbed scenes, I love those scenes in the movies. And I love the stories of deathbed scenes. They last forever. One of the most famous deathbed scenes that's lasted for over 100 years now is from the movie Newt Rockney, where Ronald Reagan played the star Notre Dame running back George Gipp, and he's on his deathbed. And with his dying breath, Gipp tells the coach, when the team needs to win a big game, Rock, and their back is against the wall and they need encouragement, tell them to win one for the Gipper. What an emotional moment. People are still talking about it over 100 years later, and a new rallying cry for Notre Dame football was born. How many times have we all heard the phrase, win one for the Gipper? It was a deathbed statement. Well, here David is going to utter his last words to Solomon. At the time of his death, he said, I am going where everyone on earth must someday go. It's true of all of us, even a man after God's own heart. Take courage and be a man. Observe the requirements of the Lord your God and follow all his ways. Keep the decrees, commands, regulations, and laws written in the law of Moses so that you will be successful in all you do and wherever you go. And if you do this, then the Lord will keep the promise he made to me. For he told me, if your descendants live as they should and follow me faithfully with all their heart and soul, one of them will always sit on the throne of Israel. Think about that promise. If they had just obeyed God, one of David's descendants would have always sat on the throne of Israel. It's amazing. Now, Solomon, you notice, began there by saying, take courage and be a man. Well, that's interesting. You say, why would he tell his son to be a man? Well, there's two reasons. The first reason is, guess how old Solomon was at this moment? 14 years old. According to the best-known Jewish historian Josephus, Solomon was 14 years old. But there's a second reason, too. And that is, you can't assume somebody is a man. Because, you see, being a male is a matter of birth. Being a man is a matter of choice. It just is. So I for years, back, if you read the regular wedding vows, the old traditional wedding vows, when you're given the vows, it says, I pronounce you man and wife. That's what it actually says in the Old English wedding. And many years, I guess 25, 30 years ago, I quit saying that. And I will say, I pronounce you husband and wife. Because like David is saying here, I can't pronounce you a man. You can't either, by the way, if you're not one. But, it's a different story. Just a little toss in for free. But seriously, I can't pronounce you a man. Being a man is a matter of birth, or being a male is a matter of birth, but being a man is a matter of choice. And so David's last words to Solomon are, hey, you grow up, be courageous, and be a man. Because Solomon had spent his whole life in the palace. His whole life had been surrounded by the perks and luxuries of royalty. You talk about somebody born with a silver spoon in his mouth. But now it's time to grow up. He needs to prove himself a man. And most cultures take that into consideration. I've been to a few bar mitzvahs where, at the age of 12, a Jewish young man has to learn much of the Hebrew language and much of their traditions and customs. And then there's a big bar mitzvah where he has to repeat what he has memorized. And there's a big party there. In the past, we've seen Indian movies and Western movies about how the Indians would take a young man out at the age of 12 or 13 and leave him alone in the forest at night. At least he thought he was alone. What he didn't know is that his father was nearby watching over him to protect him. But he didn't know that. And so there are all sorts of cultures that take this fact into consideration, a rite of passage from childhood to manhood where a boy can prove himself a man. But how do you really prove yourself a man? It's sad that in our modern culture, we usually use sinful tests. Can he hold his liquor? Will he lose his virginity? Is he willing to fight with his fists? Hey, folks, drunkenness and premarital or extramarital sex and violence do nothing to prove you a man. Nothing at all. In fact, most of the time, that stuff just proves you to be immature. Here's the true test of manhood, and it's the one that David gave to 14-year-old Solomon. Are you brave enough to obey and follow God? Because it takes a real man to go against the flow in this world and to resist temptation. So, chapter 2, verse 12 says, Solomon became king and sat on the throne of David his father. And he came to live in the city of David until he could finish building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around the city. Now, I want you to understand this when it says he brought her, because this is his first wife that he was bringing there. You know this. If you've been in church very long, you know that Solomon wound up with 700 wives and 300 concubines. Mostly because ancient kings believed the best way to ensure peace was to make your enemies your in-laws. And so common treaties were sealed with a marriage. That's the primary reason why Solomon ended up with so many wives and concubines. His harem was full of political princesses, daughters of neighboring rulers. But as God had told him, there was a drawback to this practice. Pagan princesses, and hundreds of them in the temple, brought with them their pagan gods and their pagan idols. And that is why, way back in the law, in Deuteronomy chapter 17, in the fourth lesson of Love Your Bible, we looked at a verse that talked about kings of Israel should not marry foreign women. That's exactly what brought about his downfall. Verse 3 begins in chapter 3. Solomon loved the Lord and followed all the decrees of his father David, except that Solomon too offered sacrifices and burned incense at the local places of worship. And the most important of these places of worship was at Gibeon, so the king went there and sacrificed 1,000 burnt offerings. That's going to catch up to him real soon. You'll see that as we continue to go through the text. Now, as he is going to be crowned king at Gibeon, Solomon basically invites the whole country to come. Big event. 2 Chronicles 1 tells us Solomon invited basically everybody in Israel to Gibeon. It seems to be a dedication of Solomon, not only as king, but of his whole new administration. And the first thing that happens is God offers him, as a brand new boy king, a blank check. Appears to him in a dream and says, "What do you want? Ask, and I will give it to you." Now, what if God appeared to you and said, "Make a request, any request, and I'll see that it becomes a reality"? For what would you ask? Gold? Girls? Glitz? That's what most people in the 21st century would ask for. Power. And remember here, Solomon is just a kid. He's 14 years old. At this point in his life, he's just completely overwhelmed with his new responsibilities as a king. He's just taken over from his dad, David. And so he's so young and inexperienced. He doesn't know what to do. He needs wisdom. But rather than ask for money or for honor or for long life, he asks for wisdom so he can evaluate situations and understand God's people. He said, "You showed great and faithful love to your servant, my father David, because he was honest and true and faithful to you. And you have continued to show this great and faithful love to him today by giving him a son to sit on his throne. Now, O Lord my God, you have made me king instead of my father David, but I'm like a little child who doesn't know his way around. And here I am in the midst of your own chosen people, a nation so great and numerous they can't be counted. So please give me an understanding heart so that I can govern your people well and know the difference between right and wrong. For who by himself is able to govern this great people of yours?" What an astounding request for a 14-year-old. I'd hate to even think when I was 14 years old in the 8th grade at McMurray Junior High School in Nashville, if God had come to me and said, "I'll give you anything you want, what do you want?" I'm very certain it wouldn't have been wisdom and understanding. I'm very certain of that. It would have been something very immature and foolish. Well, God was so pleased that Solomon had asked for wisdom that watch what he does. Because you have asked for wisdom and govern my people with justice and have not asked for a long life or wealth or the death of your enemies, I'll give you what you asked for, and tell you what, I'm going to give you all of that. I'm going to give you an understanding heart such as one no one else has had or will ever have. That's where the phrase, wisest man who ever lived, came from. And I will also give you what you didn't ask for, riches and fame. No other king in all the world will be compared to you for the rest of your life. And you don't only get the riches and the power to go along with the wisdom, you're going to live a long time. You're going to live a long time. So he not only gave him the wisdom, but he threw all this other stuff that Solomon could have asked for but didn't in. And immediately, Solomon gets the chance to demonstrate this newfound, God-given wisdom. Because two prostitutes came to the king to have an argument settled. Now, understand, neither party here has a good reputation for morals or for honesty. Both are prostitutes. And they are roommates as well. Please, my Lord, one of them began, this woman and I live in the same house. I gave birth to a baby while she was with me in the house. 3 days later, this woman also had a baby. We were alone. There were only two of us in the house. But her baby died during the night when she rolled over on it. Then she got up in the night and took my son from beside me while I was asleep. She laid her dead child in my arms and took mine to sleep beside her. And in the morning, when I tried to nurse my son, he was dead. But when I looked more closely in the morning light, I saw it wasn't my son at all. Then the other woman interrupted, it certainly was your son, and the living child is mine. No, the first woman said, the living child is mine, and the dead one is yours. And they argued back and forth before the king. Remember, this is a long time ago, 3,000 years ago. There's no dental records. There's no fingerprints. There's no DNA. There's no baby shoots or baby photos. Maybe thank God for that. The two women live by themselves. This is a case of one woman's word against another. What is Solomon to do? What would you do if you were the judge? Well, Solomon has been given wisdom straight from God, and he immediately says, all right, bring me a sword. So a sword was brought to the king. And he said, cut the living child in two, give half to one woman, half to the other. Then the woman who was the real mother of the living child and who loved him very much cried out, oh no, my Lord, give her the child, please. Do not kill him. And the other woman said, all right. He will be neither yours nor mine. Divide him between us. And the king said, don't kill the child, but give him to the woman who wants him to live, for she is her mother. Solomon quickly and immediately in the midst of an argument realized that a real mother will put her child's welfare above her own desires and would rather see her child live with the other mother than not live at all. And so this story has always impacted me. It impacts me even as I stand here right now because as a preacher, sometimes it seems like I encounter one impossible decision after another, and all the decisions are not always black and white. The answer is not always clear. I need discernment. And just this week, just this past week, I have dealt with 3 situations that felt Solomon-like to me. But the need for wisdom and discernment is not only true for preachers, but for parents, for business partners, for a husband and a wife. I mean, we all face tough decisions from time to time. But what I love is the effect of this ruling. The next verse says, when all Israel heard the king's decision, the people were in awe of the king, for they saw the wisdom God had given him for rendering judgment. So the 80 years that David and his son Solomon reigned over Israel, 40 years apiece, were considered the golden age of Hebrew history. In the world at large during this time period, Homer began writing poetry in Greece. The dawning of the Greek civilization had just begun. Egypt and Assyria and Babylon, the three world's most traditional powers, had begun to slide. And at that time, Israel was the most powerful, the most wealthy nation on earth, the world's lone superpower. And Solomon reigned over a global empire. He built alliances and entered into trade agreements with foreign kings that brought unprecedented wealth to Israel. He built a navy, these passages in 1 Kings describe, and a merchant marine. He opened up Israel to world markets, and in the process, his fame spread everywhere. Approximately 2 years into Solomon's reign, he decided to get started on his father's dream. You remember his father David had wanted to build the most magnificent temple on earth to his God, and God said, "You can't do it, your hands are bloody." Now Solomon wants to start to do it. And so construction begins on one of only 3 temples the Jews ever had. It was had three temples, and this was the first that they ever had. And it was a magnificent building. A temple plated with pure golden ceilings and walls and floors. Try to imagine in your mind everything on the wall, the floor, the ceilings, everything around you, pure gold. It took 7 years to complete. It stood for over 400 years until Babylon invades in 586 BC and strips away the gold and destroys the building. It was the most glorious day in Solomon's reign when this fantastic place was dedicated to the Lord. It may actually have been the most glorious day in the history of Israel itself. And it's recorded for us in chapters 7, 8, and 9 here. And by the way, interestingly enough, also chapters 7, 8, and 9 of 2 Chronicles is the recording of it. But it says that when the priests came out of the holy place, a thick cloud filled the temple of the Lord. The priests could not continue their service because of the cloud, for the glorious presence of the Lord filled the temple of the Lord. Then Solomon prayed, "O Lord, you have said that you would live in a thick cloud of darkness. Now I have built a glorious temple for you, a place where you can live forever." Now, what is this cloud? I want you to picture this in your mind. Here's this dedication ceremony. People of Israel are there, and this cloud descends throughout the whole building. You know what this cloud is? It's the same cloud that followed them out of Egypt and led them by day. It's the same cloud that settled over the tabernacle wherever they would stop in the wilderness and set up the tabernacle as an indication of God's presence among them. It is called the Shekinah cloud of glory. And now it's been in the air most of the time, and now it comes down and it fills the presence of the new temple itself. And it is so impressive the priests couldn't continue the service because of the cloud. It was a radiant shining, the presence of God Almighty. That's the cloud that led Israel through the wilderness, from which God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. That's the cloud that would fill the most holy of holies in the tabernacle. That's the cloud that Ezekiel, the prophet, saw departing from the temple. It's the cloud that encompassed Jesus at the Transfiguration. This is the cloud that just after Pentecost received Jesus back up into heaven when he ascended into the heavens. The Shekinah cloud of glory is integral to God's story all the time. That's what happened when it descended among the people himself. You know, it's interesting. I want to pull over and park for just a second and make an application there, because this was such a powerful thing that it was a fearful thing. They couldn't even continue their work. The priests, the brilliance, the heaviness, the enormity of God's presence forced all human activity to cease. And I couldn't help but think how that's different from today in so many ways. The intense sense of God's presence is not a warm and fuzzy feeling that many churches try to gin up in their worship assembly. Every time in the Bible when people felt the presence of God, there was awe. When men like Peter and Isaiah and John approached God, they felt stricken by their sinfulness and their holiness. John, when he was seeing the revelation. Moses, when he was on Mount Sinai. Isaiah, in chapter 6, when he said, I fell to my feet. God's glory doesn't bring chills and thrills and warm and fuzzies. It drives out all human ego, is what it does. And Solomon turned around to the entire community of Israel standing before him and began this prayer as his dedication speech. O Lord God of Israel, there is no God like you in all of heaven above or on the earth below. You keep your covenant and show unfailing love to all who walk before you in wholehearted devotion. And then he said something a few verses later that's just fascinating to me. I love verse 27 because it shows Solomon has never lost perspective, even with this great temple he has built. He said, but will God really live on earth? Why, even the highest heavens cannot contain you. So how much less in this temple I have built? The king has just spent in their money $30 billion. I don't even want to think about what that'd be in our money. The king has just spent in their money $30 billion in 7.5 years with hundreds of thousands of people building this magnificent temple, and yet he has truly known all along God will never fit in a house made with human hands. When will we ever learn you can't put God in a box? God is boundless. He doesn't fit into temples made by men, nor does he confine himself to man-made systems or man-made formulas or man-made traditions. Just about the time you think you've got figured out how God works, bang, he blows the side out of your box you tried to put him into. God is beyond our ability to hem him in or figure him out or tuck him away. You got to let God be God and man be man. You got to trust God and not try to fit him into a box. Well, one of the most famous stories in 1 Kings is when the Queen of Sheba heard of Solomon's fame, which brought honor to the name of the Lord. She came to test him with hard questions and arrived in Jerusalem with a large group of attendants and a great caravan of camels loaded with spices, large quantities of gold, and precious jewels. And when she met with Solomon, she talked with him about everything she had on her mind. Because understand, she had heard of his wealth, but mostly she had heard of his wisdom. And Solomon had answers for all her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. Wouldn't you love to sit down and talk to Solomon sometime? Ask him all these tough questions everybody thinks are so tough. Hear him just rattle off the answer just like without even having to think. When the Queen of Sheba realized how very wise Solomon was, and when she saw the palace he had built, she was overwhelmed. She was also amazed at the food on his tables and the organization of his officials and their splendid clothing and the cupbearers and the burnt offerings Solomon made at the temple of the Lord. She is just blown away. Now understand, this woman is fabulously wealthy and smart herself. Sheba is today the country of Yemen on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. So that's where Sheba was. And she was, and it was a very rich in resources land. So I'm sure it created quite a stir and quite a buzz in Jerusalem when the queen's large and exotic caravan pulled into town with all sorts of gifts. But she was the one who ultimately was really going to be overwhelmed. This was a queen well familiar with treasures and luxuries. But even her finest possessions paled. She said to the king, "Everything I heard in my country about your achievements and wisdom is true. I didn't believe what was said until I arrived here and saw it with my own eyes. In fact, I had not heard the half of it. Your wisdom and prosperity are far beyond what I was told. How happy your people must be. What a privilege for your officials to stand here day after day listening to your wisdom. Praise the Lord your God who delights in you and has placed you on the throne of Israel. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, He has made you king so you can rule with justice and righteousness." I want you to notice she not only was impressed with Solomon and what he had done, she was impressed with Solomon's God. She was impressed with Solomon's God. Folks, we never need for anybody to be impressed with us. We need for people to be impressed with our God. All right, little trivia question here for you. What do baseball, bowling, and Solomon have in common? They all get 3 strikes. Very good. They all get 3 strikes. Baseball, 3 strikes, make an out. In bowling, 3 consecutive strikes are called a turkey. With Solomon, he disobeyed all 3 commandments that God gave to the kings of Israel. God gave him 3. And he struck out. Missed all 3. In Deuteronomy 17, 16, and 17, God commanded the kings of Israel to not marry foreign women. This is way, way, way back, hundreds of years before Solomon's even born. And he knew the rule. He knew God's commands. But chapter 11 begins by saying he loved many foreign women. Besides Pharaoh's daughter, he married women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and from among the Hittites. The Lord had clearly instructed the people of Israel, "You must not marry them because they will turn your hearts to their gods." Yet Solomon insisted on loving them anyway. And he had 700 wives of royal birth. I told you a minute ago, that's mostly the political connected wives that were making treaties. And the 300 concubines were most likely wives in the way you think of wives. Said that way. And in fact, they did turn his heart away from the Lord. And in order to keep this large harem happy, he compromised his loyalty to God. Hey, I understand that. I do almost anything with reason to make my wife happy. Or at least for her to think she's happy and me to think she's happy. Happy wife, happy. Yeah, you do too, apparently. So when these foreign women moved into his court, they brought with them their foreign gods and pagan religions, and their idolatry became a spider that weaved a web around Solomon's heart and injected its poison into him so that before long he was betraying his own God. In Solomon's old age, they turned his heart to worship other gods instead of being completely faithful to the Lord his God as his father had been. In this way, Solomon did what was evil in the Lord's sight. Oh, what a sad thing to read. Because at this point in history, Solomon was the most powerful ruler in the history of the earth. Even the Queen of Sheba is coming and announcing it. He seems unconquerable. Yet the king of Israel had forgotten that his security did not lie in his military or his wealth, but in his loyalty to God. And so God tells him one day he will take it away from him. And a civil war is going to tear away the kingdom in the days of Solomon's own son, Rehoboam. The Davidic dynasty would still have a tribe to rule, the southern tribe of Judah, but the northern 12 tribes will break off and become their own nation and serve their own king, Jeroboam, and in the middle of it, Solomon is just a pathetic figure. He had so much going for him. He ruled in Israel for 40 years. When he died, he was buried in the city of David, and his son Rehoboam became the next king. And Rehoboam immediately has an opportunity to keep the kingdom together. Hadn't divided yet. To keep the kingdom together. Immediately has an opportunity to establish himself as the leader. Because he's suddenly given the authority to rule, but he lacks the wisdom of his father to rule. And in arrogance, he causes 500 years of damage. The Israelites by this time had become tired of old King Solomon's demands, paying taxes to support the king's palace and administration, and paying taxes to do everything to support the king and his luxury, but not themselves, building various palaces and royal building projects. And so they approached the new king and said, "Your father was a hard master. Would you lighten the harsh labor demands and heavy taxes that your father imposed on us? And if you do, we will be your loyal subjects." It would have been the politic and prudent thing to do. And so Rehoboam went to some of his father's older advisors, the wiser men, and said, "Should I do this?" And they said, "You do, and if you do, you should, and if you do, they'll be loyal to you throughout your kingship." Then he went to some of his buddies. He's a young man. His buddies wanted power too. And his buddies said, "We tell you what you ought to do. What you ought to do is make it even harder on them." So he rejected the advice of the older men and instead asked the opinion of the young men who had grown up with him. "What is your advice? How should I answer these people?" And they told him, "Make it even harder on these people." And that is the route he chose. By the way, that says to me, there's a reason why God chose elders, older, not novice, to lead the church. Isn't it amazing how life has changed since this time, 960 BC, and yet it still stays the same? The political issues today aren't much different than they were in Rehoboam's day. It's been said a man pays a luxury tax on his billfold, an income tax on the stuff he puts in it, a sales tax on whatever he takes out of his billfold, and an inheritance tax if there's anything left in it when he dies. We're taxed on every front. One man said that Patrick Henry should come back and see what taxation with representation looks like today, because it is not a whole lot better. But this story is chock full of very important lessons for us today. First, more often than not, people are way more responsive to love than they are lashes. They're more inclined to follow the person who feeds them than the person who beats them. And second, be very careful whose advice you take. Don't just listen to your peers, people who will tell you what you want to hear. Listen to older people who speak with the voice of experience and have gleaned some wisdom. And Rehoboam had learned neither one of those lessons. And as a result, the 10 Israelite tribes in the north seceded and started their own nation, which they called Israel, and appointed their own king, Jeroboam. And that began their slippery slide and downfall. They also began to worship idols and offer sacrifices to idols, the next few verses says. And so the northern kingdom, right off the bat, had placed idols in Bethel and in Dan. And this became a great sin for the people who worshiped the idols. Jeroboam also erected buildings at the pagan shrines and ordained priests from the common people who were not from the priestly tribe of Levi. In other words, he did everything wrong. Now, in the American Civil War, the Southerners were the rebels, but it was the opposite in the Hebrew Civil War. The Northerners were the rebels, and the southernmost tribe of Judah stayed faithful to David and his descendants, and that showed through the period of the years of the divided kingdom. The southern kingdom was named after the tribe of Judah, and its citizens from this point forward are called Jews. The northern 10 tribes broke away from the kings of David and formed a new nation they named after the father of all 12 tribes, Israel. It's important to keep those two apart because they wind up with very different outcomes. It reminds me of the story of a woman who one time had twins and gave both boys up for adoption. And one was adopted by an Egyptian family who named him Amal, and the other was adopted by a family in Spain who named him Juan. And years later, Juan sent his birth mother a picture, and she remarked to her husband how much she wished she had a picture of Amal as well. And her husband reminded her that the boys were twins, and she said, "Honey, if you've seen one, you've seen them all." I'm just going to stand here till you get it. Not going to go on. That's the way it was with the kings of Israel. All 19 of them, 20 in the south, 19 in the north, all 19 in the north were goons. All of them. All were disasters. 20 kings reign over Judah, the southern king, and 8 of them are good kings and gain the Lord's approval. And because of that, because of those 8 good kings, Judah got to continue for 135 years after the Assyrians captured the northern kingdom. Well, in the northern kingdom, we're introduced to one of the 3 or 4 greatest prophets of all time, Elijah. And the battle that he serves on Mount Carmel is just a classic, as you well know. I think I've said many times it's my favorite story in all the Bible. Because it really is. It shows so many different things. There's a wicked king named Ahab and a wicked queen named Jezebel, and they have led all the people, including God's people, the Hebrews, into idol worship and idol worship of Baal. They've introduced the god of Baal. And so Elijah comes along, and he is inspired by God to defeat the prophets of Baal, and they have a big contest on top of Mount Carmel, and there are 850 false prophets of Baal and one Elijah. How you like them odds? 850 to 1. And yet, Elijah wins the battle. It's amazing. Chapter 18 records that. I'm going to have to slide through that because I want to finish on time. And so, then, after Elijah wins that enormous battle, you would think he's on a spiritual high. Things could never be better ever in his life. Let me tell you, this was true of Elijah. It's been true of a lot of people I've known. It is true of me. It is true of me. The time I have to be the most careful to temptation is right after an enormous spiritual up or victory. And that's what happened. He defeated the false prophets. Jezebel said, he'll be dead within 24 hours. I'm going to hunt him down and kill him like a wild animal. He'll be dead within 24 hours. And so Elijah was afraid and fled for his life. And he went alone into the wilderness, traveling all day, and sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord. Take my life, for I'm no better than my ancestors who have already died. He did not want to die. That's depression talking. Don't ever listen to yourself when you are depressed. I've told you many times, my mentor told me, never make a decision when you are depressed. 99% of the time it will be wrong. And that's his depression talking. He did not want to die. If he had wanted to die, all he had to do was stay where he was and stay still, and Jezebel would have obliged him. He didn't want that. He was just hurting. And depression can hurt you like that. And so God loved him, got him something to eat, got him some sleep, because you miss both of those things when you're depressed, and then got him back up and put him back on the road of being a great prophet for God. What it says to me, and perhaps the greatest of many lessons we learn from Mount Carmel, is the power of just one person to change a bad situation. Elijah stood alone against 850 false prophets, but with God's backing, won. It reminds me of Edward Everett Hale's saying, "I'm only one, but I'm still one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do something that I can do." May that be true of all of us.